Every month, Steam collects a hardware and software survey for every user with Steam installed. So it being the beginning of June now, we finally have the results for May. And once again, for the second month in a row, the RTX 3060 is the most popular GPU by percentage. So I figured I would take the RTX 3060, put it against a bunch of modern games from the past month or so, as well as some older games that are still popular and have been getting updates, and see what kind of experience people are actually getting. Also, according to Steam, 1080p is by far the most popular resolution, with 55% of Steam users reporting their primary display resolution as 1920 by 1080p. You can see the specs for the 3060 that we're going to be using here in GPU-Z. While Steam doesn't specify whether it's the 8GB or 12GB version, or if it's both of them combined, I'm assuming it's both of them. I'm going to be using a 12GB EVGA model, playing on the most recent up-to-date NVIDIA drivers with no overclock applied. And speaking of drivers, it is important to know that even though the RTX 3060 came out over 4 years ago, back in 2021, it is still receiving up-to-date drivers, with the most recent driver release being in May. I have a selection of 8 games, and I'm going to jump in, check out, and see how they perform. Let's get started. And first up, we're going to be taking a look at Elden Ring Nightreign, which is obviously a very new game here. And we're playing on completely maxed out settings. The only adjustment being made is turning motion blur off. And here at max settings at 1080p, we are getting a 60 plus FPS experience here, or right around 60, given that the game is actually locked at 60 FPS, but definitely a pretty solid experience. You know, Elden Ring, certainly not one of the most demanding games, and this GPU did release the same year as the original Elden Ring, which this game is obviously built on, and it's essentially the same game engine, same map and everything. This is more of a mod for Elden Ring, so it shouldn't be super surprising that we're still getting really great performance here on the 3060. Of course, that 12GB of video memory is certainly nice to have, however, really not needed for Elden Ring. It's a challenge to even get Elden Ring to use 8GB of video memory. You're typically sitting much closer to, like, you know, the 6 or 7GB range, even at higher resolution. So yeah, max settings here, definitely a very, very playable, clean experience. One thing you definitely will notice if you compare this card, you know, directly to some of the newer GPUs like a B580 or the 5060 that I've benchmarked in this game, I am noticing that obviously, given the card's age, it is not quite as power efficient. So it's drawing a lot more power than those cards needed to draw to get the same performance. But otherwise, you know, totally great experience here in Elden Ring without really any frame drops whatsoever. Our GPU is not even actually being fully utilized, so certainly a really solid experience here at 1080p. In a new title, you know, one that is obviously has those caveats as being based on an older game, but you're getting essentially the same performance here at 1080p than you would on every other card out there due to the fact that it does have that engine lock. Now, if we were to go in, remove the lock, play mods, things like that, that could change. But just as far as like the, you know, default experience here, really, really solid. All right, next up here, we have another newer game, Doom: The Dark Ages. Again, sticking with 1080p, I'm just kind of going for the settings I think I would like. So at 1080p, while I would like to use DLAA, I want the added performance that a little bit of DLSS offers. And I do think that you're foolish not to use DLSS, especially in a game like this that you know has that transformer model that looks really great. And we're going for high settings here, and we're going to drag our texture pool size all the way up. We have 12GB, not giving us any sort of warning or anything like that, and we'll see how this runs. And you can see, you know, starting out definitely is a pretty strong experience here. Getting around 80 or so here. Now, I've done this particular run countless times, so 83 right about here. That tells me that that is right about where our FPS is likely going to be, right around 80 once we get into a more intensive scene. But we do have a room coming up here, so we'll test that out with a bunch of enemies and see how that runs. And now entering into like our most intensive area here with all these enemies. Actually, we did drop a bit lower than I was expecting. Serves me right, acting like I know everything there. So, but hanging out right in the 70 range definitely feels real solid here. And the game looks great. We're not using super aggressive upscaling, so you're still getting a really, really clean looking 1080p image, especially with that transformer model that's in here by default. Now, while this game does have a bunch of DLSS features like frame generation and even multi-frame generation with the 50 series, the 30 series of cards like this one, they don't have any sort of DLSS frame generation. So if you wanted to use frame generation, you would have to go in and use FSR. But I don't really think frame generation is needed here. You know, 70 FPS average here feels really great. Maybe if I had DLSS frame generation, I might use it, but because we don't, I'm not going to, and I don't really think I'm missing out on a ton here. Definitely a really strong experience. This is a lighter game, much like Elden Ring. Those two games, like this one and the other one, they came out and they were pretty well performing, so we're giving it a bit of a break, but these are the two biggest releases of the past month, I would say. Probably Elden Ring, Nightreign, and Doom the Dark Ages, and they're both, handled pretty well on the 3060, so, it goes to show that, it's popular for a reason. People who are playing at 1080p, the most popular resolution on Steam, they're still able to play these newer titles and, get a 60 plus FPS experience here so far. We'll see if that holds true though. But yeah, ending our little area there, averaging 76. Totally great experience there. No complaints whatsoever. Game looks great, performs well. Happy experience here. All right, next up we have Oblivion Remastered. This is a slightly older game, came out back in April. And this is, a unoptimized, not super great performing game. So it's typical, about for every well-performing game, there's maybe like 2 or 3 not well-optimized, not well-performing games that release. So we're going to take it easy here and just go for the medium preset, which in my opinion looks pretty solid. Going down to low doesn't look great. The only thing I'm going to bump up to high here is the view distance quality, and we're going to use DLSS set to quality here. And like I said, this game is not well optimized, but despite the fact that it's not really super well optimized, we're still getting actually pretty solid performance here. But really what I mean by not well optimized is there's a lot of variance in the FPS. Like we can go from 70 down to 60 up to 80, and our frame time graph, even when we're standing still, typically a frame time graph when you're standing still, if the frames are being delivered in any sort of smooth and consistent manner, it'll be flat, or at least flatter than we're seeing there. So that's just that's less of a, I guess that's kind of irrelevant because that's more issue with the game than the card. But the card and that issue is present, across any GPU that you'd use. But here at 1080p, I mean, the card is holding up well. It's getting us a 60 plus FPS average. And I didn't really aim for 60 plus. I kind of just threw settings that I thought would look decent and give us good performance. And we are doing just that, looking decent. That view distance kind of fixed that main issue I have with the game. I think the view distance being on low or even medium is incredibly distracting. Bumping up to high pretty much eliminates most of that distracting behavior. But yeah, as you can see here, getting around 70 FPS here as we get away from our more intensive area. Game looks good, performs well. It can look better, of course. There's ray tracing options that we don't have turned on. And on high and ultra settings, it does look better. But here at medium, you're having a solid experience. You're playing a newer title, a non-well optimized title, and still getting 60 plus FPS. So, the frame time graph is another thing. It's all over the place with spikes. It's a really choppy experience, but it's really that way regardless of the GPU that you use. This game is just a kind of a dumpster fire when it comes to, how smooth it is. You can get high FPS, but even when you're getting high FPS, the game is just not rendering those frames in a smooth manner. But, goes to show, even not well optimized kind of like trash remakes or ports like this, the 3060, I understand why it's still such a popular GPU, because if you bought it back in 2021 or have it pre-built with it in it, you're still able to play 1080p, have a really solid experience. It seems like you could spend more money, get a 50 series card, but you're still going to be having like a lot of these same issues. Like this game will still be just as stuttery on like a 5060 or 5070 as it is on a 3060. And you have those 12 gigabytes of video memory if you have this particular model, which I believe is the more popular model. But yeah, definitely a pretty solid experience here. The only issue I'm having is just a capture issue, which you may have noticed is no audio, but just due to the fact some of my recording settings are really meant for 4K. And I recorded the intro in 4K. It kind of just threw a few things out of whack with the recording. But in general, totally solid experience here. Oblivion Remaster. I wouldn't mind playing here. 1080p 24-inch monitor. This is going to look really great. Give you a really solid experience. And really, really happy with the performance here. All right, next and last of our newer games is actually a demo. This is the Hell Is Us demo that I'm a bit nervous about, just due to the fact that I know this game is very demanding, even on higher end hardware. So we're going to go for the medium preset here, which actually leaves most of our settings here on high, strangely enough. So actually I'm going to come in and bump these down to medium manually here. And we're going to go straight for DLSS set to balance, just to see if this works. I'm kind of concerned about the performance of this game, just because I know it's a very, very demanding title. But, 3060, that shouldn't necessarily stop you from playing, these types of games, like jumping in, trying them out. So let's see if you can still do it, at least on 1080p, right? Should be doable, hopefully. And actually here, I am actually pretty surprised at the performance. I mean, based on my previous testing, I was not expecting to get such high FPS, and the game still looks great. This is another Unreal Engine 5 game. It's not quite as poorly optimized as Oblivion, not even close, really. You see the frame time graph. This is much more kind of where we want it to look at, at most of the time being pretty flat, like when we come to a stop, at least being pretty flat, less major spikes than we were seeing in Oblivion, though. As we actually move around, we do get some spikes here, but right around 100. Let's play a little bit, get into a bit of combat here, and we'll see how it kind of looks at that point. All right, getting closer now to the point where we actually get to do some combat, and still no major drops. You can see our 1% low sitting at 81, average at 103. Really solid performance, I guess. I was playing this game on higher end hardware at max settings, so I'm assuming maybe those max settings were a bit more intensive than I thought, but we'll see. Get our weapon here, and we'll see how it looks. All right, we have a bit of combat now, and this is a game that it is certainly important that you perform well, that you're actually able to kind of perform your counters and everything like that. So FPS is important here. It's not really something that you can sacrifice too much of without actually meaningfully hurting your actual experience playing the game, and seems like at least to start here, totally fine. And even after going through that whole little dungeon area here, still holding really strong. You can see a stutter there. Imagine that's just Unreal Engine 5 doing its thing, but overall really solid experience here. Actually pretty surprised. I guess I wasn't as familiar with this game's performance as I thought I was, but yeah, definitely pretty happy with this. This is not a easy game to run, and you are able to get with DLSS and bumping down some settings, still a really great looking game, and you are able to get a super great FPS at right around 100 on our average. So yeah, another W for the 3060 in my opinion. All right, next up we have Marvel Rivals, which is not a newer game, but it is a game that came out last year and is still receiving updates, and is still one of the top played games on Steam, so definitely a more popular title. Now, it is a game that I would like to get a competitive FPS, meaning 100 plus, 120 plus. So I'm going to start off here at ultra quality DLSS. I'm going to bump down actually to the medium preset here. Now, this game is unique in that you want a high FPS, but it is a pretty game. You want the game to look good too. But the other thing to keep in mind, this game, in my opinion, it's hard to really make it look too ugly. Even with low settings, the game still looks pretty solid. So we'll see where we land here. Hopefully with these settings, we get without really messing with too much more upscaling, we get a solid FPS, but we'll take a look. All right, and starting off here, we are getting pretty close to what I would consider to be a competitive type, FPS. And this is without really sacrificing hardly any visual quality. Ultra quality DLSS looks essentially native. In fact, in a lot of situations, it looks better than playing it native, or, depending on the anti-aliasing quality that you're using. But really solid experience here, starting off around 100 or so FPS on our average. Looks like we're kind of landing right around there on our average here. We're not quite at 120 on our average where I'd like to be, so let's see how it looks, just bumping down just slightly more. So we're just going to come down to quality now, and here at quality, it looks like we're averaging out right around, keeps climbing actually. We're at 140 or so right now. Definitely a really strong experience, and you're not really making like any real, meaningful sacrifices in terms of your image quality. In my opinion, it still looks really solid. I think in this game, even low settings looks good. In fact, even on higher end hardware, I play at low settings just because I like to maximize my FPS. But averaging out right around 120, I would say this is definitely a competitive experience without even needing to sacrifice much in the terms of actual picture quality or graphic fidelity. So definitely another pass for our 3060 here. And next up, we have Fortnite, older game, but still obviously incredibly popular. Playing at 1080p with DLSS set to quality on high settings. All right, loaded in here. Again, this is high settings with quality upscaling, and we are getting a, I don't know if I'd consider it necessarily a competitive FPS. It's high, don't get me wrong, it's high. It's certainly enough for me, and I imagine for most people, but, it's above 60. Not 120, but it's decent here. You can certainly, Fortnite has so many options that you can kind of mess around with, and you can certainly get pretty much whatever, experience that you want in Fortnite. You can kind of find with all the different settings that are available. But at least to begin with, right around 90 or so, jumping up at times. So it looks like we're averaging out right around 90 or so. I would consider this like a pass here on high settings. I would like to be getting a bit higher if I'm being completely honest, but you know, it's nowhere near what I would consider to be like an unplayable or even a unpleasant or unacceptable type FPS. So, you know, Fortnite, I'd say this is a pass. You know, high settings here, you can certainly bump everything down and get a much better experience as far as our actual FPS goes, but this is definitely a good balance where you're getting a competitive enough FPS, in my opinion, without really sacrificing really any in terms of your visuals. It still looks, you know, incredibly sharp, very good. So I'd say I'm pretty happy with the performance here on Fortnite, right around 96 FPS average here, high settings, all these great looking, like the grass, like see how good everything looks. Everything looks really strong, and we're not really making any sort of like major sacrifices here. All right, next up we have another slightly older game, but another game that has been receiving updates and is pretty popular at the moment, and that is Helldivers 2. So we're going to be playing at native, so no resolution scaling here on the high presets. All right, and loading in here, obviously a lot of effects going on, and we're getting right around 70 FPS to begin with here. Definitely to begin with, at least, a pretty solid experience here. While it's not necessarily like a competitive, you know, like 120 or anything like that, this is like a PvE game. You don't really need like that high of FPS to perform well in this game. It's a relatively slow pace here, and obviously at native resolution the game does look incredibly sharp and totally great here. So while this is a slightly older game, it is a game that, you know, people go back to, and 3060 older GPU at 1080p at least, absolutely well within its wheelhouse, even here at high settings. And finishing off here with what I imagine is going to be a layup for the 3060, but imagine we are testing the most popular GPU on Steam, so it's only right we do go and test, you know, one of, if not the most popular and most played games on Steam, Counter-Strike 2. Playing at native resolution here, 1080p and high settings. And it is so annoying that they took away the Dust 2 exclusive playlist here. That is incredibly irritating. And not that it should be super surprising to most people, but of course, you know, a game like Counter-Strike 2 is a ultra competitive type game that is super easy to run on purpose to make it both, you know, performant and to make it accessible to pretty much anyone that wants to play it. So 3060 here is being fully utilized, and we are getting right around 300 FPS. So certainly, if all you're interested in doing is playing Counter-Strike 2, stick with your 3060, especially if you're on 1080p. You're going to be having a totally fine experience here, as long as you are not horrible at the game like I am. So that's been it for the 3060, the most popular GPU by Steam users this month. And it's definitely no wonder that it is so popular. No, it's a well-performing GPU, especially at 1080p. It's more than enough in most, if not all, games. And so long as you are playing at 1080p, you're going to have a great experience. Really nothing to really complain about. The 12 gigabytes is certainly nice in games that need it, especially as games are more and more often needing more video memory. So yeah, definitely thought, you know, it handled everything I threw at it pretty well, and wouldn't be upset at all having a 3060. If that was my only option, 3060, and I was playing at 1080p, I'd be totally fine as a PC gamer, jumping in, playing new titles, old titles. And of course, nowadays, PC gaming, it's in a bad spot in some ways with the market and the way things are being priced and cost. But as far as the actual options that you have, you can pretty much tailor and custom your experience to your liking, dump down settings, use upscaling, use FSR, frame generation, all that sort of stuff, and get pretty much whatever type experience that you want to have, which really shines for the 3060. You know, the fact that we can throw on DLSS, something that I thought about when the 30 series was out and the 20 series was out, when DLSS really started to take a major, you know, take a major step forward in terms of popularity. I thought forward, you know, these lower end GPUs are definitely going to benefit from this in the future, where you're going to be able to run, you know, future games and just use DLSS to kind of downscale the resolution. Now, games are becoming more and more poorly optimized, and it can be an issue, but in general, DLSS is a good thing and allows us to achieve really solid performance, even on newer titles and poorly optimized titles. Anyways, that's been it, guys. Not a super in-depth benchmark or anything like that. Just figured I would hop in, handful of games, and see what just the general performance was on the 3060 at 1080p. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.